The Farms.com Swine Report is sponsored by Acuity. Acuity Genetics utilizes a portfolio of superior genetics and technical expertise in swine management to advance commercial production. Welcome everyone to the Farms.com Swine Report. My name's Andrew Bodden, and with me today is Justin Fix and Caleb Shull. Gentlemen, introduce yourselves.
Hi, thank you for having us here today. As you said, my name is Justin Fix. My title is Director of Business Development and Genetic Improvement for Acuity. A little bit of background. I am born and raised in the Midwest, mostly of my time spent in Iowa, before heading to North Carolina for some graduate degrees in swine breeding and genetics. Out of graduate school, I spent a few years at the National Swine Registry, and then about 5 years at Smithfield before ultimately coming to Acuity and the Maschhoffs at that point in time about 3 years ago. Oversee the genetic program, as I mentioned, and here as Acuity's launched over the last 6 to 12 months, have led into a bit more on the business development side as well.
I'm Caleb Shull. I'm the Director of Research and Development for the Maschhoffs. I grew up in Illinois and went to the University of Illinois, and I've been with the Maschhoffs now for 8 years. My primary responsibility is to oversee the innovation program and make sure we're delivering innovation that generates value for the commercial business.
All right, well, thanks, gentlemen. So can you explain a little bit about the relationship? You've got Maschhoffs on the one side and you've got Acuity on the other side. How are they connected?
Yeah, that's a great question. One we get asked quite a bit is, Acuity is a wholly owned entity of the Maschhoffs, and it is a genetic business that was ultimately created from a commercial entity trying to understand and trying to figure out ways of creating more value from the boar stud to the packing plant. As we'll talk about, we understand genetics is a key component, and you may say even the leading component in terms of where production can head. And as the business was trying to continue to move forward into the future, there was realization that there was great opportunity to deliver that value through a genetic entity. And ultimately 10, 15 years later, that's where we are today.
And my role with the Maschhoffs, I work closely with Justin and Acuity to make sure that our genetic evaluation is designed correctly in a way that makes sure that we're actually realizing the value at the commercial level, and then ultimately measure the offspring of those animals at the commercial level to make sure we're consistently moving in the right direction.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. Certainly some great background and expertise combined from both of you. So I want to get into this a little bit. When we think about genetics, we often think about the beginning of genetics, the boar. Inside the swine genetics market, there are a lot of dollars spent to understand which genetics look promising. Can you tell us a little bit about the ways those lines have been historically selected?
Absolutely. As you said there, the genetics, we like to think of them as being the starting point or the ceiling for the potential of the animal. Whatever genetics is aligned in that animal determines how fast they can grow or how lean they can be or whatever that might look like, depending on the inputs. And historically, we've thought about that and driven that selection at the purebred level. The animals at the top of the nucleus are the ones that they're the best animals, right? And we focused on them and how we can continue to make progress in those year after year. But ultimately, that doesn't always make it down to the commercial level, or it's not all realized. So that's one of the key things we need to think about is it's not just how much progress we can make at the nucleus level, but how much of that gets down to the commercial producer, as well as how is that able to be obtained or attained, I should say, by the commercial producer within their system.
It's one of the reasons why we have put together a commercial test herd that actually allows us to measure the performance of our genetic progeny in the commercial environment to make sure that we're actually realizing that value at the commercial level.
Excellent. That makes a lot of sense. So as you said, inherently genetics are disseminated down. What do you expect to see or hope to see when those genetics are selected and put into use?
So there's a couple things. Sometimes we think about it, the two lines being parallel. The genetic trend is set at a certain level, and there's what we call lag. It takes a while for the genetics at the top of the pyramid to make it to the commercial level, but that genetic progress, they should be parallel. They're slightly behind, but ultimately making the same amount of progress each year. As well as, not only that aspect on a year-over-year basis, but also that we're realizing that they're not falling behind, so that we're making whatever it may be, let's say a point of improvement in feed conversion at the nucleus level, but we're only making 0.6. So not only is there the lag, but now that lag's increasing because each year it's compounding and it's falling further and further behind.
Excellent. Thank you. So Caleb, with your role, how do you know if you're seeing those expectations become reality?
Yeah, ultimately, the only way you know for sure whether or not you're getting the value of a genetic platform is you have to measure it downstream at the commercial level. It's one of the reasons why we do a lot of genetic research trials. We do multiple comparisons, evaluating different genetic lines against each other. And it's important when you're doing those genetic evaluations that you're not only looking at the average of the line, but you're also looking at a range of individual bores across the index. Because when you're trying to deploy genetics in your system, the value of that index point is really important to understand, so you know which bores you're actually, or what value you're getting out of each bore.
Well, that certainly makes sense. Caleb, when you're thinking about the genetic evaluation, what are the key components you are looking for, or what should we be looking for?
Yeah, things to consider when you're setting up a genetic evaluation. First and foremost, you need to have the right mix of traits, because if you're not measuring the right things that translate to commercial value, then you're not going to get the ultimate outcome. Secondly, you need to have enough animals and observations to have confidence in your outcome. Oftentimes, genetic trials are not done with enough power to answer some of the key traits of interest. And thirdly, you need to design the evaluation in a way that minimizes bias. There's all kinds of different sources of variation that can introduce bias into an evaluation. So you need to try to do as much as you can to control those sources of variation.
Okay. So going on a little bit more, if you think about a barn, truthfully, there's a lot of factors that impact the final output. Nutrition, disease pressure, stocking density, even the time of year. How do you account for those factors when you're evaluating the genetics?
So you can account for those sources of variation through a controlled research model. We've built multiple facilities that allow you to test individual sires pinned by sire together in one location in the barn. So we know that there's variation even within a barn between locations. So we pin individual sires and group those multiple sires of pins in one location so that the only difference we see in there is the difference in genetic line. We're also selecting these to have similar age. We're feeding them the same to ultimately only be looking at the differences in genetics and not the other variables that you can potentially see.
And on that too, so one thing the Maschhoffs will do within that is those pen adjustments. So if you start with 22 pigs per pen and one dies in one pen and not the other, they will actually adjust those pens down to keep that square footage the same to ensure there's not any bias added that way as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And that it certainly will keep a level playing field when you're trying to figure out what are the best genetics. When you're looking to select a genetic line that maximizes performance, what else should you be asking yourself?
So for our perspective, we know, if you think about the genetics, so we talk about evaluating genetics side by side, but then there's also evaluating the individual animals to ensure we're making the progress that ultimately delivers that value. So much as Caleb was talking about, okay, we're going to look at two sire lines side by side and how we compare those. The same thing as you're evaluating animals to make progress, you need to be measuring those same traits or those same types of traits that deliver value, as well as accounting for those same types of noise that come in to ensure that in his trial, he's referring to looking at the between line variation, and that's what you're doing. Well, from a genetic perspective, we want to get that down when we're selecting animals to make sure we're eliminating all the variation so we can find the within line true variation that's due to the genetic capabilities of the individual animals. So just to kind of add on to that a bit, you're comparing animals. Well, how we select animals, we want to select them with the same traits that we're ultimately trying to drive the value as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Caleb. And Justin, I look forward to seeing you again sometime. And on behalf of Farms.com, the Farms.com Swine Report, I'd like to say goodbye and thank you for joining us. And we'll see you again.